All right. Hello, everyone. This is Volts for August 27th, 2025. Climate philanthropy in a time of Trump. I'm your host, David Roberts. Over the last 5 years or so, there have been numerous articles about effective altruism and similar efforts to make philanthropic giving more impactful and empirically grounded. Many of those pieces mentioned a group called Giving Green, which seeks to apply effective altruism principles to climate philanthropy. Each year, the group issues a list of recommendations for climate philanthropic giving, boosting groups from the Clean Air Task Force to previous Volts guest, Industrious Labs, garnering coverage in Vox, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and Heat Map. To date, the organization claims its research has directly influenced $32 million in donations to its chosen nonprofits from donors of every size. It seems to me that Trump's election and the ugly, bullying, lawless version of public life we have experienced in its wake casts the cool rationalism of effective altruism in a rather different light. Or at least, I have questions. To get answers, I have with me today Dan Stein, the founder and executive director of Giving Green. Stein holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and is also chief economist at ID Insight, the global research and advisory firm that incubated Giving Green. I am excited to talk with him today about how to do good with your money in this topsy-turvy world we all live in. With no further ado, Dan Stein, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Dave. I'm happy to be here.
So I have all kinds of questions and some things I kind of want to push you on or yell at you about, even though it's probably for things you're not responsible for. But before that, let's just rewind a bit and just tell us a little bit about what is Giving Green and what is the flaw or gap in climate philanthropy that you were intending to address by founding it? What was the need that you were addressing?
Yeah, sure. So Giving Green is a climate research and advocacy organization that helps organizations and individuals make more informed, evidence-based decisions about donating to and supporting climate action to achieve the most marginal cost per dollar.
Have you memorized that entire tagline? You sound like you've said that 400 times.
I do this every day, Dave.
So you help people give money to environmental causes.
Exactly. Specifically climate mitigation. And, the thing that we saw when we were starting Giving Green, so I've been working in effective philanthropy for quite a while, doing research, trying to help donors figure out how to give money to places that are evidence-backed and cost-effective. And what I saw was, I just felt like there were more and more donors looking to move into the climate space. And by donors, we mean big philanthropies, but also, regular rich people or just mom and pop donors. We're feeling more and more inspired by climate. And this is about 5 or 6 years ago when we were getting started. We heard more and more, I want to do something about climate. I don't know where to start. I'm overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And a lot of people would look to donate and just kind of get paralyzed by indecision and bombarded with all kinds of weird stuff about offsetting your emissions and end up doing nothing or doing stuff that didn't seem that effective. So we felt that there was a kind of gap in the marketplace for well-researched, thought-out, systematic research and recommendations on what are really the big philanthropic levers that people can pull and some very actionable steps on how to do that.
So you are responding to a confusion you saw. And so what does Giving Green aspire to do? Tell us sort of what's the 2-minute elevator pitch for what you do for a donor. You help them donate to groups that are making a difference, but what does that look like in practice?
We hope to provide a really clear, transparent, and well-researched guide and recommendations to donors looking to slow warming. So we have a step-by-step process that is laid out in detail, step-by-step on our website. So starting at focusing on philanthropic strategies that we think are really impactful, and then moving down to actual organizations that we think have really outsized impact. And we hope that somebody can come to our website or read some writing about us and just say like, hey, I really want to make a difference. I want my donation to be high leverage. Here's some places I can give. Another thing that we do that's been really growing over the past couple of years is a regranting fund. So people can give to us, and then we can allocate it based on our research and our principles.
I see. People who've looked into effective altruism are familiar with the sort of three criteria, sort of the three famous criteria: urgency, tractability, and neglectedness. Is that roughly your framework?
We frame things a little bit differently, but it's really not far off. We call it scale, feasibility, and room for funding. So, we're very focused on climate mitigation. So scale means if you're going to do something like, I don't know, protect a certain piece of the rainforest or try to invent fusion technology, the question is, how much greenhouse gases emissions could be avoided or removed if this thing was successful? So the scale of the problem. We want to work on big systems changing, world changing problems. And feasibility is a question about whether we think it's something that philanthropy can really make progress with, right? Is there a viable theory of change, or is this something that is A, really practically impossible, or B, private sector or government are going to be a lot better suited to work on? And then C is the room for more funding. And we're looking for things that have potentially not caught the eye of the really big donors in the space, where we think there might be extra leverage from working on problems that are a little bit overlooked or a little bit more difficult, and where we can find our niche as somewhat newer, medium-sized climate donors.
So this is a good frame, I think, for people to understand why you give to some groups and not others. Because there are groups that you might say, are addressing a very important problem that's been neglected, but have no practical strategy, or they have a practical strategy and it's a problem that's been neglected, but the problem is not that important climate-wise. So these are sort of the, this all has to come together for you to feel like you can be more effective. Could you maybe walk us through like a group that you have sort of like selected and assessed, and maybe just briefly talk about like why you picked that one, how you use these criteria to pick an individual group, just to give us a little bit more concrete sense of what it looks like to walk through this?
Yeah, totally. So how we get to the group is we start at a level that's called a strategy. So there's actually a spreadsheet on our website that anyone can look up that lists something like 50 strategies that we have considered. And a strategy could be like working on a certain technology like geothermal energy, or it could be funding activists to go throw paint at pictures in the Louvre. Kind of a wide variety of things that people might be interested in working on, and kind of put them through the ringer of this scale, feasibility, and funding need framework until some of them pop to the top. And currently, we have 8 strategies that we're excited about. And then within those, we go into sub-strategies. So, I'll walk you through one that I think is maybe a little interesting, a little bit different. Well, maybe not for your readers. So food and agriculture is obviously this large contribution to emissions and is particularly neglected in the policy sphere. We see all kinds of incentives for clean energy, clean transportation, but there's very few laws on emissions for agriculture. It's a big political issue. Nobody wants to touch it. I'm sure you well know. So we think this is this big issue that just no one is really working on. And specifically within agriculture, livestock is, this big emission source that's not at all on track for emissions reductions. And then so we basically have a report, like how would you reduce livestock emissions? There's all kinds of things you can do. We can look at different sub-strategies. But for us, the thing that really floats to the surface is thinking about how to decrease demand for meat through better technologies, alternative proteins, right? Like how it seems to me the only way you're going to really bend the curve of having tons and tons of cows everywhere belching out methane and clearing the forest for cows is to decrease the demand for meat. And the only way you're going to decrease the demand for meat that feels realistic in my mind is by replacing it with some new technology that's just as good but doesn't need cows. So we kind of go down that funnel and say like, okay, well, we need to support changes in our food system and through alternative proteins, and then start looking at, well, what organizations are doing great work there. And one of our top recommendations is the Good Food Institute. That's kind of the marquee name in the nonprofit space promoting alternative proteins.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about effective altruism, because I think As you know, effective altruism has become kind of a buzzword lately and has become extremely controversial lately and has gotten enmeshed in all kinds of discourses. And I'm sort of wondering, like, how, just as a almost a branding question, I'm just sort of curious, like, how closely do you associate yourself with that term? Like, do you view Giving Green as effective altruism? Like, are you squarely in that camp, or do you hold it at an arm's length, or like, sort of how are you feeling about the larger effective altruism world right now?
Yeah, I mean, we're not really squarely in that camp because climate is just not really a cause that is interesting to most people in that community. So,
Which is puzzling to me, let me just say.
yeah, it is puzzling to me as well. I mean, we consider ourselves an effective giving organization that's trying to use evidence to get people to give to impactful causes. And obviously, there's overlap with that and the principles of effective altruism. I mean, the problem is you have a word like this and it's become a buzzword that means a lot of different words to different people.
Yes.
You know, the things that I like about the effective altruism movement that I believe are the core values are that, you know, people should be using their time and money to make the world a better place. And they should be thinking systematically about how to use that time and money in ways that are really, you know, have oversized impact. And if that's effective altruism, then I'm on board.
Right. Well, this is kind of what I want to. I mean, I find this is true of many sort of like controversial ideas. Is that if you poke and prod a little bit, you find a kind of obviously true version, and then a sort of like extreme version that gets attention, but that is obviously false, and a lot of conflation of the two. So, in a sense, like, you should give money to make the world a better place. Yes, obviously. And if you're going to do that, you should try to have the most effect you can have.
Yeah.
Yes, obviously, right? Like,
I'm into both those things.
duh. But the notion, I guess, I think where a lot of people bump up against it is this idea that we're going to take like this godlike view of all eternity and create this giant mathematical formula which will yield a sort of objective ranking of things by impact. And I know that, like, surely you've been involved in climate long enough to know that, like, we don't know enough to, you know what I mean? Like, we don't know enough to do that. Like, those rankings, I mean, that's what sort of bugs me a little bit, is this notion that you can get a bunch of smart dudes in a room and just through the power of thinking, they can figure out what's going to work and what isn't. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're not just a bunch of dudes, but, you know.
Another way you're different from the larger effective altruism world.
I mean, I completely agree with you, Dave. Like, we're not omniscient. We don't have some sort of monopoly on the truth. But I do think that our core audience are people who are passionate about climate and maybe know a little bit about it, but have not spent their time getting into the weeds. And so you don't need a perfect mathematical formula and all seeing into the future and having all of the probabilities lined up to make major progress, you know, on this problem of making recommendations and provide a lot of value to people who are not experts in the climate field. So I don't think there is something ridiculously special about our approach that's, say, more mathematical and more logically true than the approach of many other climate philanthropists. You know, I think one way that we have deviated from some of the more, let's say, core effective altruism approaches is really embracing a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. You know, we have some numbers, like what is the scale of the problem, and sometimes we'll build little models of what is the chance we think that this bill will pass, and if this bill passes, you know, what did Jesse Jenkins think the emissions reductions will be, and kind of back out some math. But that's just one tool in the tool set, because even these models are filled with tons of uncertainty, and then we have to combine that with lots of qualitative data from just talking to people. What do people think will happen? You know, what's the theory of change? Do we think the theory of change is viable?
That all makes sense to me. You're just sort of selling like we did some thinking about this. We looked into this a little bit. You're not selling it like we figured out the right answer.
I think we're too humble for that. I would say what we've done is really thought systematically about this problem, looked into it a lot, and come up with what we think are some very compelling and viable approaches that we think are high impact. I would never say we figured it out, we found the perfect things, everything that's not on our list is crap.
Right.
But I think we've made progress on the problem that can help a lot of people. I mean, just as another analogy of what I would say is that, I think that within professional foundations, you have people doing a lot of the same type of thinking. They're coming up with frameworks. They're trying to figure out where their money can be best used, a combination of their comparative advantage and where the highest leverage points are. The thing is, it's all behind closed doors and inaccessible to the public.
Yeah.
And so I actually think that one thing that we do, like what's more valuable than having a super incredibly unique approach or having all the answers that no one else has, is just really extreme transparency and being able to open up those steps and that knowledge to a far wider audience.
Yeah. And one thing I will concede, and I think that anybody who's been in this space for a long time who's being honest should concede, is that the pre-2019 baseline is there's just a lot of sloppy thinking, a lot of big claims, a lot of money flying around without a ton of due diligence. Like there was need for some rigor in this space. I'll just say that. So let's get more into the stuff that I have a beef with.
Oh gosh, that wasn't it already?
No, I mean, all of that makes perfect sense. And, I think a lot of people, when you say the words effective altruism these days, you get a lot of people who come with a lot of assumptions about what that means and the attitude of the people involved and et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanted to sort of establish that you guys are just trying to work these things out, very transparent about what you're doing, not claiming to be the eye of God, just trying to be helpful. And the other thing is, and I don't know that people just coming to this new really get this, it's not, to my mind anyway, your primary service is not someone who's going to donate money, donates here rather than there. It's, as you say, a lot of people sort of vaguely want to give money and just don't know where to give at all and just probably wouldn't have given at all without some sort of guide. You know what I mean? I think this does uncork donations that otherwise wouldn't have found their way here. So that's all to the good. So last year, you were talking to Rob Meyer at Heatmap, and he made a point to you. He said this list of Giving Green donees choices has evolved over the years. He said when it first started, there was sort of an even mix of what you might call civic activism groups, like, say, the Sunrise Movement, and then your sort of technocratic expert data and analysis type of groups, like the Clean Air Task Force. And he made the point that over the years, the list has shifted a little bit and some of that civic activism has dropped off and the technocratic expertise has sort of taken over more. And your response was, well, our recommendations change as politics change. And back then, we were in a big election, trying to get Dems elected, trying to get them to pass a bill, et cetera, needing civic activism. Now we're elected. We've got the bill done. Now we need implementation, which is for the technocratic analysis crew, which made sense at the time. Now, of course, fast forward half a year from then, and politics has changed again, to say the very, very least. So my question to you is, just like you responded to political changes before, how do you anticipate responding to these, I would say, extreme political changes of recent times?
Yes, certainly the landscape has changed dramatically over the past half a year, and we as philanthropists are needing to react to this change. In fact, we have a new strategy coming out in the next couple months that's going to precisely talk about this. Like what can philanthropists do specifically at the U.S. federal level? Like what options are available? But I think a little bit of a step back is that we and a lot of other philanthropists had to make this choice in the Trump era where there's clearly a huge amount of headwinds of getting any climate policy done. Climate advocates are on their heels. And so there's a question, is it a time to just kind of exit from U.S. federal policy? I think you see a lot of the groups that we work with moving to work at the state level or local level, Also, one option is to just do a lot of work outside of the US where there seems to be more avenues for progress. And what we've done is taken a multi-pronged approach. So first of all, even before the Trump election, Giving Green was moving to be much more international, looking at making grants in LMICs and in Europe. And we're going to be ramping up that work. Ultimately, this is a global problem, and with emissions coming from all over the world. And I think it makes sense for people in philanthropy to be working on these problems in other places, especially at a time when progress seems kind of on hold in the US.
I mean, this is kind of one of the critiques of effective altruism is if you really take it seriously, like in the climate space, you would just be sending all your money to like Vietnam or or whatever. You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't mess with America at all if you're really doing the math.
Well, I'm not sure about that, actually. Besides being a large economy, America is also a trendsetter in the world and just a major innovator in technology.
Yeah.
So I think that there are certain places where the US has comparative advantage to make progress for the global system. I mean, I think even regardless of US politics, an optimal climate strategy would probably have some work in the US because of the unique role it plays.
Yeah.
But also, be looking at places at poorer countries where you might have more bang for your buck. I do think it's complicated though, because for instance, you mentioned Vietnam, but like, is there a way for a US-based philanthropist to activate civil society to change the government's mind in Vietnam? Like we've looked into it, for instance.
It's almost like you need to give to a Giving Green in Vietnam, right? That could then give the money to the effective, it's almost like you need a Giving Green for each country.
Yeah, you could. And in fact, we've worked with local groups trying to do similar things. But just this question of like philanthropic giving to nonprofits, is that like a lever for change in all countries? We've looked at China, for instance, and it just doesn't appear to be.
Yeah.
And I think Vietnam goes in that. But anyway, I think your point is still made that there's like your money can go further in certain countries. Like maybe India is a better example, where we actually did make a bunch of grants last year where there is an active civil society. Foreigners can make grants to at least pieces of it. That's obviously a huge emitter.
To be clear, that's not what I'm advocating for. I'm just saying, like, if you're doing this sort of like pure, left brain carbon math, that's where it would lead you.
Maybe.
So, okay, you go outside the U.S., some outside the U.S. That's one response.
Right. Our other response is to stick with U.S. federal policy and both see where there are avenues for defense and maybe even some progress in bipartisan ways. So our upcoming strategy will have 3 pillars. One is clean, firm power, which seems to be a place where, so we have previously funded in nuclear and geothermal, and both of those technologies seem to be at least relatively favored by the current administration. So there may be ways to push those forward in the next few years. The next one is reducing barriers to energy deployment. So things like permitting, interconnection queues, where hopefully reducing barriers, would help clean energy in a disproportionate way. And then the third is on innovation, which is a long-time bipartisan issue. Probably if you asked the modal Republican 20 years ago what their climate policy would be, it would be innovation. But these days, clean energy innovation is also a little bit under attack, and we think it could be supported.
Well, by innovation, they meant something 20 years from now, and then like the innovation happened, and they're like, hey, whoa.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that certain pieces of the U.S. federal government have been successful engines of innovation, like ARPA-E and the Loans Program Office.
Yeah, the LPO is kicking ass.
I know, and so it's a little frustrating that these things are under attack, but we think that there is support for these programs on both sides of the aisle that can be rallied.
Okay, well, all of those make some sense to me, but also there are some omissions that I would like to press on.
Let's talk about it.
I'll save the big one for last, but the one is, what about state level action? Like a lot of people are looking around where progress is still possible, and they're looking and they're seeing, PUCs, state legislators, city councils, a lot of places where change is still happening, still possible. Why not shift to a state and local based, or at least shift resources toward state and locals? Why continue to bash your head against the federal?
I mean, that's fair. And a lot of the nonprofits that we have supported and will continue to support are going to do that. And we support those efforts. I think the reason that it hasn't been a super high priority is a couple of reasons. I mean, first, we're resource constrained and trying to figure out, the PUC in all 50 states and who are the best groups, who's the best group in Idaho to come sit in the PUC meetings is maybe a little bit beyond the pale for us. But the second is that like a big driver for us of supporting US-based work among anything you could do in the world, like I said, are these, being a global leader, driving in innovation, exporting technology, and so much of that happens from the federal level and can't really be created at the state level. It's not completely true. You do have some of the larger states doing innovation in both the technology side and the policy side, but largely these things have been federal efforts.
Well, and you could also argue that the only thing that ever gets through on a federal level is things that have been built up and leveraged from the state level. I mean, you could say that a lot of state progress was a prerequisite for federal progress.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a great argument.
Another aspect, and this came up on social media too, is one effect of shifting from kind of civic and activism groups to more sort of analytical technocratic groups. One side effect of that is that, I guess, to put it bluntly, more of your money is going to white people and less is going to climate justice groups and, groups doing that work tends to be more civic, tends to be more ground level, et cetera. How do you think about that larger subject?
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, really, we do have this pretty targeted focus on mitigation and trying to figure out what are the groups that are going to be the most effective in the mitigation fight and looking at that wherever it leads. I do think that when you look at our portfolio, a lot of the groups that we support have diverse staff, work on equity issues, especially when you consider grants made in outside of the US in India and Korea, et cetera. So I don't think that accusation is completely accurate. That being said, I do think there is something here that you marked on before, which is like, is it a time now where the technocrats are making less progress to be thinking more about grassroots action that would set up the technocrats?
I'm nudging in that direction, Dan. You're seeing where I'm heading.
Yeah. I think the thing that I would say is like, my eyes are wide open for this. And we don't have any type of position on whether insider technocrats are better and worse than outsider activists. In fact, when we did research on this a few years ago, we came to the conclusion that both were super important and we wanted to support both types of groups. And we still believe this. But you're right that our portfolio has shifted a little bit. I think partially because we've just gotten more excited about the progress potential of certain groups who are working in certain ways. I don't think that's going to be true forever. We've got our eyes open for groups that we think can cause social and policy change, working on all kinds of different levers, and are totally open to supporting more grassroots efforts if exciting opportunities come our way.
So on a similar theme, let me just put this to you. It seems to me, looking back at the last year, when I'm thinking about what is the most, just whether you measure in terms of literal tons of carbon, whether you're measuring in terms of policy, whether you're having even more sort of vaguer measures of political economy, however you choose to measure it, it seems to me like the highest leverage thing that anyone could have done in the past year for climate would have been to prevent Donald Trump from being elected. You can't argue that, right?
It seems probably true.
Preventing Trump from being elected would have prevented virtually all the things that we're fighting against now that are spiraling out into millions of different fights. And we could have just contained that and not started it all in the first place. So then my question is, if effective altruists are serious about their math, I think that fact was clearly visible before the election, right? Like even before the election, if you wanted to do the maximum good for the climate, by far the best thing you could have done was prevent Trump from being elected. So why doesn't the sort of logic and the math of effective altruism lead to that? Why didn't you devote all your resources to preventing Trump from being elected? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who changed majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts. People using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Why didn't you devote all your resources to preventing Trump from being elected?
All right, a couple of reasons, Dave. The first is we are legally prevented from doing so. We're a US 501c3, and we cannot engage in political activities.
Oh, that. But doesn't that in itself, this gets at it. Isn't that itself putting the lie to the idea that this is some sort of objective measurement of results? Because if you want the big results, you do politics, right? Isn't that, where am I wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. Maybe I should kind of reel back and say within the realm of activities allowed by nonprofits, we're looking for the best. And the truth is that's where a lot of the money that we are trying to influence is sitting, right?
Yeah,
a lot of this money sits in DAFs or philanthropies, and it's just constrained. And then the other problem with this argument is was there a way to do anything? There was so much money deployed. How much money did Bill Gates give in the waning days of the election? 50 million. And we at that time were giving out a couple million. Could we have done anything even if we were constrained? I don't disagree with you that was such a big fork in the road, and that if someone could have changed that outcome, it would have made more difference than anything else.
I really think they should have, frankly, and I'm not afraid to say so.
Even outside of the legal stuff, was there something feasible that, say, climate philanthropists could have done? Maybe. This is a good philosophical argument, but it felt hard at the time. It was like a war with 1 million people on each side, and you're thinking about adding one extra infantryman.
Yes. I will just say, though, that I feel like a lot of the people on our side were not trying as hard as they might have. They had other points they wanted to make, other axes they wanted to grind. Everybody thought it was somebody else's job to get the actual... Anyway, I won't belabor that point, but let me just broaden that out a little bit. So I wrote a post for Vox a few years ago, one of my favorite posts I ever wrote, one of my personal favorites, and it just was basically making the point, I've been in this game now for 15 years. I looked around. I want good, clean energy and climate policy passed. So I look around. When does that happen? Where does that happen? And over the last 15 years, I've noticed a very, very, very clear pattern. In fact, I can offer you, reader, one simple trick to get great climate and clean energy policy passed. And it's called electing enough Democrats that they can act without Republican opposition. It drives me mad that this is a plain, demonstrable, empirical fact. And I documented it at some length in this post. You can almost not find exceptions. Basically, any time in the last 20 years, anything good has happened for climate and clean energy. I'm exaggerating a little bit. I know there have been some congressional deals on nuclear power, whatever, edge cases. But by and large, the Democrats want to move in the right direction on this, and Republicans want to move in the wrong direction. So again, maybe you couldn't have prevented Trump from getting elected, but just boosting the electoral fortunes of the Democratic Party would have the effect of getting more climate and clean energy policy passed in more places. That also seems inarguable to me. So again, you're not political, but does that not seem like the main axis of difference to me? Do you know what I mean?
Well, Yeah, there's certainly a lot right about what you said. Like I said, we are constrained in doing politics. There's another way to look at it. And I guess I sort of feel like, as people focused on climate, that, the swings back and forth in electoral politics of the US almost seem like forces beyond much control.
To seem like animal spirits, don't they?
And so I totally understand what you're saying. Maybe this is the most important thing, and maybe we could influence, but maybe we couldn't. The other way to try and think about it is to try to think about how to integrate climate more into the mainstream such that it is less of a majorly political swing issue.
Yeah. But that has been precisely what the climate movement has been trying to do for like 30 years now to know. To me, that's demonstrably a failure. You can make a place for conservatives at the table. You can invite them. You can put out a little name card. But if they don't show up, they don't show up. You know what I mean? And they haven't shown up. So the bipartisan route, part of what triggered me is seeing that you're now, as a response to the election, giving money to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm just those guys, what have they ever, they don't offend anybody, but have they ever moved anybody? Have they ever got anything done? You know what I mean? This bipartisanship, where does it go? What does it produce?
I think they have. It's small victories, right? It's not the wave of climate policy that we saw in the Democratic trifecta, but it's small backroom deals on ensuring that the Loans Program Office is funded, on the Office of Geothermal Demonstrations.
Yeah, I guess that just feels like such a such a modest rearguard action to me. I guess let me just phrase what I've been dancing around here. I saw a quote from you. You say there's the swings in American politics. I saw a quote from you earlier. You said, these are long transitions. I'm more sanguine because it's a 4-year period, but it's a long game. And I guess this is kind of what triggers me. It's not just you. I'm sort of using you as a stand-in here for sort of what I see is animal spirits loosed on the nation. Something pre-rational, pre-enlightenment, even pre-Christendom, something very ugly and deep, loosed on our nation, running wild. And I see the sort of people like me, my people, the sort of educated, urban, liberals who like the facts and the numbers and the arguments, sort of sanguine that in the long run, reason will win, and the arc of history is bending toward justice, and this is just a distraction, a flailing, and we'll get back on track. And I guess just I no longer have faith that is what's happening.
But what's the alternative? The alternative is just to
I don't know,
somehow change politics so that the left always wins. The problem with the only progress.
Yes. Well, at least win more. This is what I think of all the responses I'm hearing to Trump getting elected. The thinking I'm hearing is, well, where does this still leave a little bit of room? And let's try to maneuver within that room. But what I'm not hearing is fascists are taking over. We need to fight the fascists. Not figure out what can still be squeezed out of the system that fascists are in charge of, or how to work with the fascists on marginal policy advances, but how to fight and beat fascism. I don't hear anybody going to that. Do you know what I'm saying? Everybody seems to have faith that the sort of arc of history thing is working in liberals. It seems to me an open possibility, at least, that we're off on a different branch of history, and then we're in crisis and it's emergency and it's just time to fight, not negotiate, but fight.
I see that, but I guess I just don't really see. We're far off the path of climate philanthropy, but I guess I'm just not really sure I see this path to long-term victory on the left. You see what is happening right now with just some of the policies of the current administration seem just purely vindictive. It's we hate the left.
Most of them.
The left loves wind, so down with wind, or stuff where it just scratches your head. It's just a personal affront.
Well, Superman being nice to people. Libs like that, so
I know.
So
I know.
We have to hate it.
But I would say that there's this downside of the like burn it all down, let's fight strategy, which is that then if you lose, everything is gone.
Well, I mean, what? The fascists are going to take over? They're going to kidnap people off the streets? They're going to open, concentration camps? They're going to take over colleges? They're going to invade U.S. cities with federal troops? Like, what is they're doing the thing. The thing is already happening. You know what I mean? It's already falling apart.
The thing that I mean is just kind of like undoing all of the climate policies of the previous administration. So then the left fights, the left wins, they redo all the policies or whatever, and then we just get like this yo-yo. And that just doesn't feel like a productive way forward.
But the alternative, trying to make it a bipartisan consensus, hasn't worked either. So let me get back to climate philanthropy. You're right, we're a field, but this does connect back. You mentioned systems change. So, one of the critiques of effective altruism is by doing these sort of calculations, there's a little bit of like, you miss the big picture. And like for systems to change large systems like law and politics, social systems, takes a long time, a lot of efforts, and it's not always clear which of the efforts actually worked and which didn't. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot of people banging their heads on walls for a long time before something happens, and no one quite knows what of all those efforts worked. So you have to, and you write a whole post about this, if you're going to work toward systems change, you have to loosen up a little bit this sort of like calculating of tons. Do you know what I mean? You got to take a little bit of a broader look. So this gets to something I've always thought about, right versus left philanthropy. And I know you've heard this critique, and I would love to hear your response, which is as follows. It seems like what the right has been doing for decades now, is investing in its nonprofit, think tank, advocacy world in a way that is patient. They just offer these groups money. They don't say, you have to achieve X, Y, and Z by X date. They just fund them, and they say, go fight for our cause. The Heritage Foundation, on and on and on. There's all these groups. And so what the right has built is not so much individual groups working on individual goals as an infrastructure. They have a large infrastructure in place such that when new things come up, like, for instance, I think about Waxman-Markey. When the Waxman-Markey bill came up, the left had to spin up like this whole new infrastructure to explain to people what the hell a trading system is, blah, 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 blah. On the right, they just called it a tax, and all the machinery swung into action. Do you know what I mean? It was all there. It was all built already. It just needed to be aimed in a different direction. And that's the thing. When you have infrastructure in place, when each new, especially in these unpredictable times when it's so difficult to know what the issues are even going to be or who's going to do what or what's going to happen, it's good to have infrastructure in place that can be adapted and aimed toward each new issue as it arises. The complaint on the left, and I know you've heard this, from donees, from recipients of philanthropic money, is that on the left, there's a lot more nickel and diming. There's a lot more, here's a provisional grant for 1 year, and you have to fill out, reports every 3 months, quantifying your progress towards X goal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It prevents these groups from sort of building over time and establishing themselves as infrastructures. So you get a lot of like poorly paid people on individual things, and then they get moved out of the movement. So the movement never has any sort of institutional memory. It never builds up this kind of infrastructure. Basically, right philanthropy is patient and open, and left philanthropy is sort of like constantly doing these calculations and requiring reports and metrics, et cetera. So that, it seems to me, in an era where you have a completely unpredictable, flailing fascist on top of things, and you don't even know what he might try to do, you almost by definition can't have a group in place for each individual issue. Do you know what I mean? Because you just don't know what he's going to make an issue. So you need infrastructure in place, is my point. Do you agree with that broader critique?
Well, I guess I'm not really so familiar with this differences in left versus right philanthropy. I actually hadn't heard precisely that narrative before, so I don't think I'm that well qualified to talk about how things might be different on right philanthropy.
But you've seen, right? I mean, you see the infrastructure they've built. You've seen all these groups. You've seen all these,
Yeah.
all these advocacy groups. They're just out there, money flooding into them. Like if you're a young person on the right, you can go straight out of college into one of these groups and you will be taken care of, literally paid, fed, trained, moved through the infrastructure all the way. You know what I mean? And there's just the left does not have anything like that.
I certainly agree that the climate movement in particular should have strong, well-funded, long-term organizations that are constantly, doing advocacy, putting out reports, reacting to policies, proposing new policies. Some of these things exist. You have the Sierra Club, you have WRI, you have Clean Air Task Force, sort of blue chips climate orgs that are doing this, always involved. But I would agree that there does seem to be some difference between how the right has really stuck to certain messages and then jumped on opportunities when they've gotten them.
And when they started doing this, like back in the 80s and 90s, they were completely in the wilderness. Like they were completely on the outside. They had no prospect of anything concrete happening. But they didn't, that didn't stop them from funding these groups in a long-term way. I guess, that critique applies more to the really big money on the left. And I don't know that you are quite big money.
We're medium money.
Medium money. You know what I mean? But I do feel like there's a little bit too much attachment on the left to project-based or mission-based or outcome-based. Everybody wants to be a quant. Everybody wants outcome-based. But and too little, just like, here's money, just go do things.
Yeah, I actually think we're more aligned with you than you maybe think about this. Like, because we have this systems approach, and by systems, I generally mean, in order to make change, we need to change policy, we need to change markets, and we need to change technology. And we know these are really, really long-term, difficult goals, whether it's going to be up or down. And so we're very comfortable funding organizations that have long-term goals, that have reasonable strategies to get there. And we know that there's going to be ups and downs, and it's a long-term battle. For instance, I talked about the Good Food Institute earlier. We first funded them during, let's say, the peak of the alternative protein euphoria.
The first hype wave.
Since then, there's been this terrible crash, and now everyone thinks it's worthless. And we're going to keep funding them because we still think it's important, and maybe it's a 10 or 20-year goal. But yeah, and there's going to be ups and downs. So I actually think that's kind of consistent with what you were saying. Maybe that example is like too issue-focused.
Well, no, it's just like, this is what I'm talking about. Just like have that group around for things that come up in the food space. You know what I mean? Just have lines of attack ready to go. Just have the advocacy and the politics ready to go, rather than having to sort of spin them up on the moment over and over again. And the systems change thing. One other thing about that. So you talk about systems that you want to change. There's policy, of course, the sort of rules of the road. There's technology systems, which, as you say, take a long time to change. But again, I'm reading these systems, and it seems to me like what's missing from the list is like, socio-political systems. I come back to this again. Like, if you want, it seems to me, to solve climate change in the long term, biggest picture-wise, the main system you need to change is you need to push people and systems in a broadly progressive direction. It seems to me that's unavoidable, because you've got to have global cooperation. You've got to have sacrificing today to benefit tomorrow. You've got to have, all these things that are anathema to the right. You see what the right is doing when they get in charge. They want to put up walls. They want to dig all the fossil fuels out. That is the reactionary approach. So changing public sentiment in a broadly progressive direction seems to me, this is what I don't see anybody saying as a response to what's happened, is like, that seems to me the most important fight, albeit the most fuzzy one, the most difficult to really measure progress on, the most difficult one to know how to engage with. I acknowledge all that, but also the big one. Do you not agree with that?
Well, I guess I just think using this umbrella term as broadly progressive is just not quite the one I would use. I would agree with you that one important facet of system change is the broad belief of the populace, and that we would like the broad populace to care about the future and coordinate with other countries and be able to work on really hard long-term problems together. And, for that matter, believe that we have a problem with the climate. I just think there are multiple ways to get there. And I think that like working completely through progressive systems and progressive language and then just kind of building the power and having that take over the population might not be as realistic as trying to make some of these ideals a bit more widespread among people of slightly different political stripes. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the right was totally fine with international coordination and long-term thinking.
I don't know about that, Dan. They rejected Kyoto. They've been rejecting international agreements as long as I've been alive. They signed on to one or two, but like, this is the thing. People looking for actual examples of right-wing cooperation or right-wing progress on that are grope for these tendentious examples because it's very difficult to find concrete, obvious, in front of you examples of this happening. I guess it's just like, I know we're not going to resolve this here, but this is like what I see on the right is, they're like, we want to win. That's the vibe I get from the right. We want to win, not we want to come to a peaceful state of cooperation with our opponents. We want to win. And I can't get anyone on the left to say, I want the left to win. And it just sort of baffles me why we refuse to take our own side. Like, you believe in the values of cooperation and pluralism and egalitarianism and like lifting up the weakest and breaking up concentrations of power. Like, you believe in those values, don't you? Then why don't you want them to triumph? Why don't you want to drive your enemies before you and hear the lamentations of their women, etc.? Like,
I want the values to triumph. I don't want.
Why are there no fighting liberals?
I don't want there to be a civil war. Like, you don't spread values through war.
No, but you have to fight for your values if you want them to triumph. I mean, what does it tell the average citizen about the depth of our conviction and our beliefs if we're just like constantly passive and constantly backing down? And the reaction to like Trump getting elected, a bunch of climate philanthropists saying, oh, well, I guess we better move out of the climate space. I mean, that's like case in point. Their first instinct is not hand me my halberd. I want to go destroy and kill these people. Their first instinct is like, welp, better sneak off to another area where nobody will yell at me. You know what? You know what I'm saying, Dan? I'm just ranting at this point, but
I did not understand it either. I share your frustration on that one.
Yeah, I just want people to fight, I guess, I want people who believe in like decency and goodness and kindness and fairness to fight with the same passion that assholes fight, and I just don't see it. But anyway, I don't know. I'm making you the representative of this entire tendency, so I could yell at you. But that's the card you drew. So we're out of time here. Thank you for coming on. By way of concluding, maybe just tell people what they can do and what you're involved in right now. Like, what's next for Giving Green?
Yeah. So Giving Green is in the midst of our deep yearly research cycle. We're going to be releasing a bunch of new reports on how we think donors can affect global emissions in the short and long term. Some new reports on shipping, aviation, and clean energy in the US are going to be coming out with a big release in October. And for people who are inspired by our work, you can feel free to give to our recommended organizations, to give through us, through our fund, or always to reach out to us to chat a little bit more about the research, about the recommendations, about where money might be best allocated, about why Dave is right about everything and I'm wrong, and you want to fight me about it. I'm happy to have those conversations.
You say you start with strategies and sort of work backward to groups. And I know that you've probably had the experience and are probably having it now of at least some places finding strategies which you think are important and not finding a group doing it.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, calling for the creation of a group. Have you sort of like called a group into existence yet with this strategy?
Well,
maybe you don't want to claim ownership of a.
We've been very early donors to groups. I don't know if we have incepted a group from zero, but I think you're right, Dave, that like we do see some strategies that we think are potentially really impactful and haven't seen maybe not any groups or groups that we think have really compelling strategies. And one of these things is really effective grassroots organizations that are building power, be it among youth or whatever constituencies, and then really having political power. Back when we recommended Sunrise a few years ago, we thought they really distinguished themselves in the field by building power and then using it. And we've struggled to find similar organizations.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, that's a good place to end on the call for more and better grassroots fighters. Fight and they will fund. There you go. All right. Well, Dan, thanks so much. Sorry for treating you as a representative of all of liberalism.
That's fine. We don't come on podcasts to have little softball conversations. It's fun to get into it.
Yes. It'll be amusing to my listeners that the one person I actually yell at is the person who's literally coordinating philanthropic donations to climate organizations. Okay. Well, thank you for your work, Dan, and keep at it. And I'll be keeping track.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.